The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was a stagnant, sterile blanket I knew too well. It clung to my skin, a second, unwelcome suit. The hum of the industrial refrigerator units in the adjacent room was a low thrum against the silence, a constant reminder of what waited behind those steel doors. I traced the condensation ring left by my lukewarm coffee cup on the stainless steel table. It was a small, insignificant imperfection in the otherwise clinical, unforgiving landscape. My hands, usually steady, felt a tremor I couldn't quite suppress. It had been years since I'd been back here, back to this place that had once been my dominion, my sanctuary, and ultimately my ruin. The chief medical examiner, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with weariness, had called me at an ungodly hour, not with a request, but with an implied command. "UserHH," he'd said, his voice raspy. "I read the only one who can make sense of this. It's peculiar." Peculiar was an understatement. The dispatch had been terse, but the few details that filtered through had snagged on something deep within me, a memory I'd tried to bury under layers of regret and self-imposed exile. I ran a gloved finger along the edge of the autopsy table. It was cold, unforgiving. My eyes scanned the array of instruments laid out with surgical precision. Scalpels, forceps, bone saws, each one a tool of revelation, and for me a reminder of what I'd lost. My career, my reputation, my belief in my own judgment, all shattered by a case that had been too complex, too perfect, too much like this one from what I'd heard. The chief reappeared, his footsteps echoing on the tiled floor. He carried a slim manila folder, its edges worn. He didn't offer it to me, just placed it on the table, a silent offering. "The Vic," he began, his voice low, is male, mid-30s. No ID found on him. Looks like he was found down by the old shipping docks. Cause of death, that's the puzzle. I opened the folder, my breath catching. Inside were photographs, stark and unflinching. The body lay on the table, pale and still, arranged with a deliberate, almost artistic finality. But it wasn't the violence that made my stomach clench. It was the presentation. The way the victim's hands were positioned, the subtle placement of a single, wilting rose on his chest. It was a signature. My mind flashed back, unbidden, to the countless nights I'd spent in rooms just like this, piecing together the stories the dead could no longer tell. I saw the faces of victims, the anguish of their families, the smug certainty of the perpetrators I'd helped bring to justice. And then I saw that case, the one that had ended it all. The one where the killer had been too clever, too precise, leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs that had led not to them, but to me, the investigator. The preliminary findings, the chief continued, oblivious to the storm raging inside me, show no obvious signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. The toxicology report is still pending, but the pathologist is leaning towards something internal, something administered. But the placement of the body, the rose, it's like nothing I've ever seen. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the photograph. The rose. It was a deep crimson, its petals bruised and delicate. The same kind of rose that had been found at each of the previous crime scenes. 3 others, all unsolved, all dismissed as unrelated until now. Until this. The meticulous staging, the subtle symbolism, the utter lack of conventional evidence, it was all a mirror. A warped, terrifying mirror reflecting the ghost of my past. My hands were clammy inside my gloves. This wasn't just another case. This was an echo, a taunt. The killer, whoever they were, knew about my past. They knew what would draw me back. They were playing a game, and I, UserHH, was their unwilling pawn. Anything else? I asked, my voice raspy. I needed more. I needed to understand how this was connected, how this killer had managed to replicate the artistry of the man who had destroyed me. The chief hesitated, then reached into the folder again, pulled out a small, clear plastic bag. Inside was a tiny, intricately folded piece of paper. It looked like origami. "This was tucked beneath the rose," he said, his brow furrowed. "We haven't opened it, thought I should be the one." I took the bag, my fingers brushing against the cool plastic. The paper inside was a pale, almost translucent blue. It was folded into a complex shape, a delicate bird, its wings outstretched. It was beautiful in a macabre sort of way, and it was a challenge, a direct challenge. My eyes met the chief's. The weariness in his gaze was replaced by a flicker of something else, hope, perhaps, or just desperation. He knew I was the best. He also knew what I'd been through. I looked back at the photograph of the victim, then at the folded paper in my hand. The sterile air of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, felt charged, heavy with unspoken history and a looming, unknown future. The past had come calling, and it was wearing the face of a killer. The paper bird felt impassably fragile in my hand, a stark contrast to the heavy, metallic scent that clung to the air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light. My fingers, still faintly sticky from the evidence bag, traced the delicate folds. It wasn't just a message, it was a taunt. The killer knew me. They knew my history, and they were playing games. The detective stood across the stainless steel table, his face cast in sharp shadows by the single bulb. He hadn't moved since I'd picked up the origami. His silence was a heavy cloak, amplifying the hum of the ventilation system and the distant, muffled drip of something. I didn't want to think about what that something was. "This is the same signature," the detective finally said, his voice low and gravelly. "The same way they left the others." I nodded, my gaze still fixed on the paper bird. The intricate folds, the precise creases it spoke of patience, of skill, and of a deeply unsettling obsession. It was the same artistry that had adorned the scene of the crime that had shattered my career, the one that had led to my quiet, disgraced exile from the world of forensics. "They're not just killing," I murmured, my voice barely a whisper. "They're leaving breadcrumbs, telling a story. And you're the only one who can read it," the detective finished. He took a step closer, his eyes boring into mine. "The chief wants you back on this. Unofficially for now, he said you owe him." Owe him. I owed him nothing but the wreckage of my reputation. But the glint in his eyes, the grim set of his jaw, he knew I couldn't refuse. Not when faced with this. Not when the past had come knocking, or rather, had left a paper bird on a slab. I looked around the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light. Except this time I wasn't the one dissecting, I was the one being dissected. "What do you need me to do?" I asked, the words tasting like ash. He pushed a slim file across the table. "The latest victim. He was found this morning. Same Mo and this." He gestured to the paper bird. We found it clutched in her hand. I opened the file, my fingers fumbling slightly. The photograph on the first page made my breath catch. A young woman, her eyes wide and unseeing, her skin unnaturally pale. But it wasn't just her. It was the staging. The way her body was positioned, the subtle arrangement of objects around her. It was a tableau. A grotesque, meticulously crafted scene designed to convey a message that screamed my name. A faint tremor ran through my hand as I turned the page. The preliminary report detailed the cause of death, a method so precise, so elegant, it made my stomach churn. It wasn't brute force, it was calculated, it was scientific. "This is him," I said, my voice gaining a brittle edge. "This is the same killer, the same mind." The detective nodded. "We think so. No one else could pull this off, not with this level of detail. The chief remembers what you did before, how you saw things others missed." I remembered too. I remembered the late nights, the thrill of the chase, the satisfaction of piecing together the fragments of a broken life. I said, my mind already racing, piecing together the faint scent of ink, the texture of the paper. "What kind of paper is it?" The detective shrugged. "Standard copy paper." The lab said, "Nothing special." "Standard copy paper doesn't fold like this without a specific technique," I countered, my gaze flicking back to the bird. "And this ink, it's not standard printer ink, it's too vibrant, too rich." I could almost taste the pigment on my tongue, a ghost of a memory from 1,000 hours spent hunched over lab equipment. He watched me, his expression unreadable. "I think I can do this." I met his gaze, a flicker of the old fire igniting within me. "I don't have a choice, do I?" The tension in the room was palpable, a coiled spring ready to snap. The county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, had become my unwilling sanctuary, the place where my past and my present collided with a sickening thud. The game was on, and this time I was playing for my life. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was thick with the smell of disinfectant and something else. something metallic and lingering. It always was, but tonight it felt heavier, pressing in on me. My hands, steady as they'd ever been, even after all this time, reached for the sterile gloves the detective had left an hour ago, a grim silhouette against the harsh fluorescent glow of the hallway, leaving me with the body and a silence that screamed louder than any siren. This was it, the beginning of the unraveling, or perhaps the tightening of the noose. I'd sworn I was done with this. Done with the cold slabs, the silent witnesses, the ghosts that clung to the air like stale smoke. The staged scene, the unnerving precision. It was a phantom limb, ache from a wound that never truly healed. I pulled on the gloves, the latex snapping against my skin. My gaze swept over the table, taking in the canvas I was about to work on. The victim was a man, middle-aged, his features slack in death. But it wasn't the state of his body that held my attention. It was the meticulous arrangement. The way his hands were positioned, palms up, as if in supplication. The single, perfectly placed white rose resting on his chest. It was a signature, old and arrogant, a taunt. "All right," I murmured to the quiet room, my voice raspy from disuse. "Let's see what you've left me." I started with the basics, the methodical dance I knew by heart. Documentation, photography, sketching. Every angle, every detail, no matter how small. The killer had been careful, almost obsessively so. No obvious signs of struggle, no forced entry at the victim's residence, which the detective had confirmed. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a carefully orchestrated performance. My fingers traced the edges of the rose's petals, impassably pristine. No smudges, no dirt. It looked like it had been plucked from a florist's display just moments before. I carefully bagged it, a tiny, potent piece of evidence. Then I moved to the victim's skin. I examined his hands first, running a gloved fingertip over the pads of his fingers, searching for any trace evidence. A microscopic fiber, a speck of foreign material. Nothing. The detective had mentioned the cause of death was unclear, pending my examination. No visible wounds, no trauma. That was the first puzzle piece that didn't fit. How do you kill someone so cleanly, so artfully? I moved to the victim's neck, my breath held. The skin was pale, almost waxy. I looked for petechiae, the tiny red spots that could indicate asphyxiation. There were a few, but not as pronounced as I'd expect. It was ambiguous. My gaze drifted to the victim's clothing, a simple, well-pressed suit. I carefully unbuttoned the jacket, then the shirt. And there it was, subtle, almost invisible against the pale fabric of the undershirt. A faint discoloration, a circular mark about the size of a silver dollar just below his sternum. It wasn't a wound, not in the traditional sense. It looked more like a burn, but without any charring or blistering. The mark was a deep, unnatural shade of purple, almost black. It didn't look like anything I'd encountered in my previous work. The precision of it, though, that was the killer's hand. A deliberate, targeted application of something. I carefully swabbed the area, collecting a sample. This was the first real clue, the first crack in the killer's perfect facade. But what was it? A chemical agent, a specialized tool. The possibilities swirled in my mind, each one more unsettling than the last. I continued my examination, my focus sharpening. I documented the faint scent of almonds that, until now, I'd dismissed as a residual odor from the embalming fluid. But now, with the knowledge of that mark, it took on a new significance. Cyanide. A classic poison, but the delivery method was what was so perplexing. It explained the lack of visible trauma, the subtle signs of asphyxiation. But the mark, it didn't fit. Cyanide typically acted systemically, not with such localized, precise application. A shiver traced its way down my spine. This killer wasn't just smart. They were inventive. They were playing by a rulebook I didn't have access to. Someone who understood the body, the chemicals, the very fabric of life and death, and wielded that knowledge with terrifying precision. I meticulously worked through the rest of the autopsy, my mind a whirlwind of hypotheses and questions. The toxicology reports would be crucial, of course, but I wanted to see what I could glean from the physical evidence first. The killer had left a breadcrumb trail, a twisted scavenger hunt designed to be found, to be analyzed. They wanted me to know they were here. They wanted me to play their game. As I finished my initial examination, bagging and tagging each piece of evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Not by eyes, but by an unseen presence, a consciousness that had anticipated my every move. This was more than just a murder. It was a challenge. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, hung thick and cold, smelling of disinfectant and something far more primal. It always did, but tonight it felt heavier, pressing down on me like a shroud. The detective had left hours ago, his patience worn thin by my meticulous, infuriating pace. He'd barked something about needing sleep, about wanting answers, not a scientific treatise. I just nodded, my focus already locked onto the slab. The victim, a middle-aged accountant named Mr. Abernathy, lay under the stark light, his features peaceful, almost serene, too peaceful. That was the first thing that snagged at me, a tiny burr under my saddle. The detective's initial report, the one he'd impatiently skimmed over for me, mentioned no struggle, no forced entry. It was as if Mr. Abernathy had simply faded away. But fading away in your own living room, looking like you just drifted off to sleep, that wasn't a natural occurrence. Not with the faint, almost imperceptible pallor of his skin, a shade too grey for someone who died peacefully. My gloved fingers traced the faint line of the incision the coroner had made earlier. Clean, expert. But underneath, where the tissues were exposed, I saw it. A subtle discoloration, a faint bluish tint to the muscle fibers. It wasn't the vibrant red of oxygenated blood, nor the deep purple of deoxygenation. It was different. I leaned closer, my breath misting the air. This was it, the signature, the ghost of a technique that had haunted my nightmares for years. The killer wasn't just staging the scene, they were manipulating the very process of death. They were using something to mimic natural causes, to throw off the initial assessment, to make the victim appear to simply stop breathing. I pulled out my portable digital microscope, the cool metal familiar in my hand. The tiny camera hummed to life as I brought it close to the tissue. On the small screen, the cellular structure of Mr. Abernathy's muscle fibers resolved into focus. And there it was, clearer now. Tiny crystalline structures, embedded within the cells, disrupting their normal function. They were almost microscopic, easily overlooked by a less seasoned eye, or one working under the pressure of a ticking clock. My mind raced, a whirlwind of past cases and forgotten textbooks. What could cause such a localized cellular disruption, leaving behind inert, crystalline deposits? Not a common poison. Most poisons left a chemical residue, a trace that could be identified through toxicology. This was something physical, something that interfered with cellular respiration at a fundamental level. I remembered a fringe study I'd encountered years ago, dismissed by most as theoretical, bordering on pseudoscience. It explored the effects of specific, inert microparticulates on biological systems. The idea was that these particles, when introduced into the bloodstream, could physically lodge themselves in cellular pathways, effectively suffocating the cells from the inside. It sounded like something out of a bad science fiction novel, which was why I'd filed it away and never looked at it again. Until now. A shiver traced its way down my spine, a sensation entirely unrelated to the chill of the autopsy suite. This killer wasn't just smart, they were terrifyingly knowledgeable. They understood the subtle nuances of physiology, the blind spots in standard forensic procedures. They were a ghost in the machine, leaving behind a phantom cause of death. I started documenting everything, my camera clicking softly, my stylus scratching across my digital notepad. I took tissue samples, carefully preserving them in sterile vials. I needed to run a more detailed analysis, something beyond the basic toxicology the county coroner's office would perform. I needed to identify these particles. As I worked, the familiar gnawing doubt began to creep in. Was I seeing things? Was this just my own paranoia, my own desperation to connect this new case to the one that had shattered my career? The detective had been clear. This was a new investigation, a new killer. He didn't care about my past. He just wanted this murderer caught. I remembered the look on his face when I'd first shown him the initial findings, the subtle cellular changes. He dismissed it, his brow furrowed with impatience. UserHH, he'd said, his voice strained. We're looking for a killer, not a science project. What does this mean? It meant everything. It meant this wasn't random. It meant the killer was deliberate, precise, and terrifyingly familiar with the very science I dedicated my life to. The silence was broken only by the low hum of the ventilation system. They were using it as a blueprint, and the next step in their meticulously crafted design might just be me. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something I couldn't quite place. It clung to the back of my throat, a phantom scent that always made my stomach clench. Detective Miller stood by the stainless steel table, his shoulders hunched, the harsh glare catching the sweat beading on his forehead. He'd called me here, agitated, his voice a low rumble over the phone. "You need to see this, UserHH now." I'd arrived expecting another puzzle, another victim meticulously arranged like a macabre art installation. The first two had been bad enough, the artist, then the architect, both found in their own sterile environments, their deaths staged with an almost theatrical flair. But this was different. The victim on the slab wasn't a stranger to me, not entirely. My gaze swept over the body. The familiar, almost clinical precision was still there. The way the limbs were positioned, the subtle alignment of the head, it spoke of a deliberate hand, a mind that understood anatomy, that knew the body's vulnerabilities. But then my eyes landed on the small, folded piece of paper tucked beneath the victim's left hand. It hadn't been there in the initial crime scene photos. Miller had pointed it out, his voice tight with suppressed urgency. "They added it after we secured the scene," he'd said, his jaw working. "The photographer saw it when he was packing up, thought it was a tissue, almost missed it." My gloved fingers trembled slightly as I reached for it. The paper was crisp, folded with an unnerving neatness. Unfolding it, I revealed a single stark word, written in elegant, almost calligraphic script. "Closer." A chill, unrelated to the morgue's ambient temperature, snaked down my spine. This wasn't just a message to the police. This was for me. The killer knew I'd be looking. They knew I'd recognize the patterns, the subtle nods to my own past research, the breadcrumbs they'd been leaving, and now they were taunting me. "What the hell does that mean, UserHH?" Miller's voice was rough, his patience wearing thin. He'd been a good detective for all his gruffness, but this case was clearly fraying his nerves. He didn't understand the personal venom seeping into these killings. I turned the paper over, my eyes scanning the blank back. Nothing, just the word, a single, loaded syllable. "It means they know I'm onto them, detective. It means they're not just trying to send a message to the authorities. They're talking to me." My mind raced, sifting through the fragments of old case files, the ghost of my own downfall. The Scorpion killer, they'd called his back then. A phantom who left no trace, whose methods were so sophisticated they'd baffled the best. Until I'd gotten too close. Until I'd made a mistake. Until my career had imploded, leaving me adrift in a sea of professional pariahdom. And this victim, I gestured towards the body. "Who are they?" Miller sighed, running a hand over his face. "Arthur Finch, retired librarian, lived alone. No enemies anyone can think of, quiet man. He was found by his neighbor this morning when he didn't pick up his morning paper. Door was locked from the inside. A librarian, not an artist, not an architect. Someone seemingly ordinary. But the staging, it was still there. The way his spectacles were placed on the bedside table, perfectly aligned with the edge. The single, unopened book placed on his chest, its title facing upwards. The Art of Deception. My gut twisted. This was more than just a twisted game. This was personal. The Scorpion had always operated with a certain clinical detachment, a cold, intellectual superiority. But this felt angry and intimate. The Scorpion's signature was always about the how, not the who. I murmured, more to myself than to Miller. He reveled in the scientific impossibility of it all, making a body disappear, making a murder look like an accident. This is different. This is about the why. I walked around the table, my eyes tracing the contours of the victim's face. No obvious signs of struggle. The toxicology reports from the first two were still pending, but I had a hunch they wouldn't show anything out of the ordinary. Whatever this killer was using, it was undetectable by standard screening, or perhaps it wasn't a substance at all. "They're trying to draw me in, Miller," I said, my voice low and steady, forcing down the rising panic. They want me to make another mistake. They want to see if I'm still as sharp as they remember. Miller grunted. Well, you're the one who's supposed to be the expert. What does closer mean to you? I looked back at the word on the paper, then at the victim. Arthur Finch, a librarian, a keeper of knowledge, and now a pawn in a deadly game. It means they're getting bolder, I said, the words tasting like ash. It means they're no longer content to just mirror the past. They're writing their own ending, and I think they want me to be part of it. I felt the weight of it settle on me, a suffocating blanket. The county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, suddenly felt like a stage, and I was being forced to play a role I'd spent years trying to forget. The Scorpion was back, and he was playing for keeps. And this time he was playing with me. The sterile air of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, did little to clear my head. It was a familiar scent disinfectant and something metallic, something that always clung to the back of my throat. I stood over the slab, my gaze fixed on the deceased. The scene was a grim tableau, a perfect replication of the first Scorpion murder that had shattered my career. The precise placement of the objects, the subtle ligature marks that spoke of a practiced hand, the chilling absence of struggle, it was all there, a morbid echo. A colleague, a woman with tired eyes and a perpetually furrowed brow, was meticulously documenting the scene with a digital camera. Her movements were efficient, almost robotic, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside me. I could feel her watching me, a silent question in her gaze. He knew about my history with the Scorpion case, the whispers that had followed me for years. Anything, UserHH? He finally asked, his voice low, barely disturbing the heavy silence. I shook my head, my eyes still scanning the body, the room. It's too perfect, I murmured, more to myself than to her. The original had a certain rawness, a desperation. This feels rehearsed, like a stage play. She paused, her camera hanging by its strap. Rehearsed how? I walked around the slab, my gloved fingers hovering just above the skin. Look at the staging. The arrangement of the tools, the specific angle of the body. In the original, there were subtle imperfections. A smudge of blood here, a slightly askew object there. Those weren't mistakes, they were tells, signs of the killer's state of mind, their struggle with the act. This time, I gestured around the room. It's too clean, too deliberate. It's like someone is trying to teach us how the Scorpion used to kill. My colleague's brow furrowed deeper. Teach us, or mislead, that was it. The Scorpion wasn't just back, he was taunting us. He was orchestrating these murders not to recreate the past, but to manipulate the present. But why? And how was I, UserHH, fitting into this twisted narrative? I knelt beside the body, my attention drawn to a small detail near the victim's left hand. A faint, almost imperceptible discoloration on the skin, like a faint bruise that had already begun to fade. It was too subtle to be a result of the murder itself. I leaned closer, my breath catching in my throat. It was a mark, a very specific mark. What is it? My colleague asked, her voice tinged with concern. This, I replied, pointing. This mark. It's not from the killer, it's something else. I'd seen it before, years ago, on a piece of evidence that had been dismissed, overlooked. It was a residue, a trace from a specific type of industrial solvent. A solvent I had worked with extensively in my own lab, a solvent that was notoriously difficult to remove from skin. The Scorpion knew my past. He knew my work, and he was leaving behind evidence that pointed directly to me. This wasn't just mimicry anymore. This was a setup. He was framing me, weaving me into the very fabric of his crimes. He's not just copying the old case, I answered, my voice a low growl. He's using it to create a new one, and I'm the star witness, or the prime suspect. My colleague's eyes widened. You think? I know, I interrupted, standing up, pacing the small space. He's leaving clues about me. The solvent residue, the specific staging. It's all designed to make us look at the original case, and then at me. He wants me to be consumed by this again. He wants me to make a mistake. The weight of the realization pressed down on me, heavier than before. The Scorpion wasn't just a killer, he was a puppeteer, and I was one of his strings. He was forcing me back into the arena, not to solve his crimes, but to become entangled in them. The game had changed. It was no longer about catching a killer. It was about proving my own innocence before I was buried under the weight of a past I couldn't escape. I looked at the deceased again, at the meticulously arranged scene. It was a masterpiece of deception, a carefully constructed lie designed to ensnare me. The Scorpion wasn't just intelligent. He was intimately familiar with my methods, my blind spots. He was using my own expertise against me, turning my greatest strength into my potential downfall. Tension in the room crackled, a palpable force. I could feel the net tightening, the walls closing in. This was no longer about justice. It was about survival. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was a cold, sterile blanket. It always was, but tonight felt particularly suffocating. My breath plumed in the dim glow, a visible manifestation of the unease churning in my gut. The lingering scent of disinfectant, sharp and biting, did little to mask the fainter, metallic tang that clung to this place like a phantom limb. I'd insisted on coming back. My colleague, the one who'd been so eager to point out the similarities between the current murders and the decade-old case, was skeptical. "UserHH," he'd said, his voice low and weary. "It's late. We've been over the files a dozen times." "Not these files," I'd countered, my own voice tight with a resolve I didn't entirely feel. Not with fresh eyes, and not with the Scorpion actively playing games. He'd finally relented, his gaze a mixture of concern and that familiar, unspoken judgment. Now I stood alone, surrounded by the silent, draped forms on the stainless steel tables. The single overhead light, stark and unforgiving, cast long, distorted shadows that danced with every flicker of my peripheral vision. I tried to focus, to push back the intrusive images of the victims, both past and present. My fingers, clad in thin latex gloves, traced the worn edges of the original case file. It lay open on the examination table, a tangible link to the disaster that had defined my early career. The original Scorpion, the one who'd been caught, tried, and incarcerated, had been a meticulous mimic, a shadow of a genius, or so I'd thought. This new killer, the one who was leaving me breadcrumbs, was something else entirely. They understood the science, yes, but they also understood me. I'd spent the last few days poring over the evidence from the old murders, looking for the anomaly, the detail I'd missed. The original investigation had been thorough, or so everyone had claimed. But thoroughness, I'd learned, was a subjective term. I'd been too focused on the toxicology reports, the fiber analysis, the ballistic data. I'd been looking for the how, not the why. And more importantly, I'd been looking for the who within the confines of the evidence, not the who outside of it. My gaze fell on a faded photograph of the first victim from the original series. Her name had been a whisper in the news cycle, her face a fleeting image. But her laboratory, the scene of her demise, had been my focus for weeks. I remembered the precise angle of the arterial spray, the subtle discoloration on the fingernails, the faint scent of ozone that had been dismissed as a faulty air conditioning unit. Ozone, I murmured, the word a puff of condensation in the frigid air. It was an odd detail. Most poisons, most methods of murder didn't leave that signature. Unless it wasn't a byproduct of the murder itself, but a deliberate addition. A flourish. I flipped through the report, my gloved fingers rustling the brittle pages. The original analysis had focused on the complex chemical agent used, a custom-synthesized neurotoxin that had been incredibly difficult to trace. It had been the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. But what if the ozone was the real clue? What if it was a calling card, a signature that had been overlooked in the rush to identify the poison? My colleague had mentioned the current victims were found in sterile environments, almost surgically clean. The Scorpion, as he'd called himself, was leaving no trace. But the original killer, they'd been almost too clean. So clean, in fact, that it had raised suspicions about the scene being staged. I dismissed it at the time, caught up in the scientific puzzle. I pulled out my tablet, its screen a harsh rectangle of light against the gloom. I began cross-referencing the original crime scene reports with the preliminary findings from the recent murders. The recent victims were found in abandoned warehouses, docks, underground bunkers, places that, by their very nature, were anything but sterile. Yet the scorpion had managed to scrub them clean. Impassably clean. The ozone, it was a powerful oxidant. It could neutralize certain biological traces. It could sanitize. What if the original killer hadn't just been mimicking a scientific process, but actively using it to erase something? And what if this new scorpion was doing the same, but on a grander scale? I remembered a detail from the original autopsy of the first victim. A minor contusion on the back of the skull, dismissed as a fall. But the position, it hadn't been consistent with a fall. It had been more like a blunt force trauma delivered with precision. And the toxicology report, while confirming the neurotoxin, had also shown trace amounts of something else, something that had been flagged as inconclusive and then buried in the footnotes. A volatile organic compound. I scanned the original lab notes, the scribbled annotations of the forensic pathologist who had since retired. There, in almost illegible handwriting, was a single word next to the VOC entry: peroxide. Peroxide. Ozone. They were related. Oxidizing agents. My heart began to thud, a heavy, insistent rhythm against my ribs. This wasn't just about mirroring a past case. This was about a continuation. The original killer, or someone who knew them intimately, was still out there. And they were using the same playbook, only with a more sophisticated understanding, a deeper malice. The weight of the realization pressed down on me, heavier than before. It was no longer about catching a killer. It was about understanding a ghost. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m. Single overhead light hummed with a low, persistent drone, a sound that usually faded into the background of my work. Tonight, though, it felt like a gnawing insect, a constant reminder of the stillness surrounding me. The draped forms on the stainless steel tables were more than just bodies. They were pieces of a puzzle, scattered and silent. I pulled on a fresh pair of gloves, the snap of the latex echoing in the cavernous room. My own reflection, gaunt and tired, stared back from the polished metal of a tray. I'd been through the files again, the cold, hard facts of the current victims, 3 of them now, all men, all in their late 40s, early 50s, seemingly unconnected, no shared profession, no obvious social circles. But the staging, that was the killer's signature, and it was screamingly familiar. The precision, the unsettling artistry. It was the same dance of death that had shattered my career a decade ago. My fingers traced the edges of a photograph on the table. The first victim, a mid-level executive, clean, almost too clean, except for the subtle discoloration around his fingernails. I'd noted it then, dismissed it as a quirk of decomposition. Now it felt like a beacon. I flipped to the file for the second victim, a retired teacher, same discoloration, faint but there. And the third, the one from yesterday, a freelance graphic designer. My gaze snapped to his hands. Yes, there it was again. What am I missing? I muttered, the sound swallowed by the sterile quiet. The previous investigator, a gruff but decent man who owed me a favor, had cleared out an hour ago, leaving me to my own obsessive methods. He'd looked at me with that weary pity. He knew my history. He knew what this case stirred up. I picked up the file for the original case, the one that had become my albatross. The victim, a young architect. I remembered the meticulous examination, the late nights poring over microscopic details, the same discoloration. I'd flagged it then, but the department had been too eager to close the case, too quick to blame my overthinking. They'd said it was contamination, an anomaly. They'd been wrong. A tremor ran through me, not of fear, but of a grim sort of exhilaration. It was a pattern, a deliberate, hidden clue. This killer wasn't just staging the scenes. They were leaving a breadcrumb, a twisted taunt for anyone who knew what to look for. And I was the only one who knew. I spread out the crime scene photos of all 4 victims, the architect from my past and the 3 men from this week. The discoloration was undeniable. It wasn't contamination. It was a chemical agent, something applied post-mortem or perhaps even during the act, designed to leave a specific trace. But what and why? I leaned closer, my breath misting the glossy paper. The architect's case had been about a rare, obscure chemical used in antique photographic processes. I'd found traces of it painstakingly on his fingertips. The current victims. The discoloration was similar, but not identical. It was a variation, a progression, or a deliberate change to throw me off. My mind raced, sifting through years of stored knowledge, dormant but not forgotten. I'd spent so long trying to scrub this profession from my life, to pretend the sharp edges of forensic science had dulled. But the moment I'd seen the news about the first current victim, the old instincts had clawed their way back. I needed to know the exact composition of the substance on each victim. That meant getting samples, and that meant a discreet call to a contact I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who owed me a considerable debt. He worked in a specialized lab, one that could analyze trace elements with a sensitivity far beyond standard forensic capabilities. I pulled out my phone, my thumb hovering over the contact. This was risky. It was unorthodox. It was everything I'd sworn I'd never do again. But the alternative was letting this killer continue their macabre exhibition, their personal echo of my downfall. The choice was stark. Fade into obscurity and let the past repeat itself, or step back into the darkness and fight. The quiet hum of the lights seemed to intensify, urging me forward. I pressed the call button. My own voice, when I spoke, was a low rasp. "It's UserHH, I need a favor." The discoloration, it was the key, it was the link, and it was leading me somewhere. The question was where, and who was orchestrating this symphony of death. The puzzle pieces were starting to form a shape, a terrifying, familiar shape. The county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, hummed with a sterile chill that usually seeped into my bones, but tonight it felt like a second skin. The discoloration, that faint, almost imperceptible blue-green hue on the victim's fingertips, was the thread I'd been yanking on, and it was starting to unravel something big. I'd spent the last few hours hunched over the slides, my eyes burning, my brain a whirring engine of possibilities. This wasn't just a signature. It was a scientific calling card. The preliminary reports from the latest victim, the art dealer, had arrived an hour ago. Same microscopic traces of a specific industrial solvent, the same peculiar cellular degradation pattern. It was the same story, told with a different corpse. The repetition was maddening, infuriating, and in a twisted way, exhilarating. It meant I was getting closer. I pushed away from the microscope, the worn leather of the stool creaking in the oppressive quiet. The air was thick with the ghost of formaldehyde and something else, something metallic and coppery that always lingered after a fresh arrival. My gaze drifted to the stainless steel table, currently empty, stark under the harsh glare. It was a canvas, waiting, and the killer was the artist. I replayed the dealer's autopsy in my mind. The subtle bruising on the inner wrists, almost masked by rigor mortis. It was too controlled, too deliberate. This wasn't a crime of passion. This was a performance. My phone buzzed, jolting me. A text from the detective. "Anything." I typed back, my fingers flying across the screen. "The solvent, it's the same. And it's not common. A lab, a manufacturing plant, or someone who used to have access." I let that hang there, a silent accusation aimed at my own tarnished past. I stood and walked over to the large, cold metal sink, running cold water over my hands, scrubbing them with a vigor that bordered on violent. I needed to think, to connect the dots that seemed determined to scatter. The discoloration. It wasn't just a chemical reaction. It was applied, carefully, deliberately, like a painter adding a final, telling stroke. Who would know enough about forensics to stage something like this? Someone who understood decomposition, toxicology, trace evidence. Someone who understood me. This killer wasn't just mimicking the old case. They were taunting me. They knew my methods, my blind spots. They'd studied my downfall. My mind flashed back to the press conference years ago. I paced the length of the autopsy suite, the rhythmic squeak of my shoes on the linoleum a counterpoint to the low hum of the ventilation. The killer was brilliant. There was no denying that. But brilliance without a moral compass was just a sharper weapon. I stopped in front of the evidence locker, my reflection staring back at me tired eyes, a jaw set with grim determination. I saw the ghost of the disgraced scientist, the one who'd been paraded as a cautionary tale. But tonight, that ghost felt different. It felt like a survivor. The solvent. It was the key. I needed to trace its origin, but how? A full-scale investigation would take weeks, and we didn't have weeks. We had days, maybe hours, before the next body turned up. My gaze landed on the small, overlooked vial of trace evidence from the art dealer's apartment. A tiny fleck of dried paint found on the underside of a dropped canvas. It had seemed insignificant then, a random speck. But what if it wasn't? What if the killer had been there, not just to commit the murder, but to collect something, or to leave something else behind, disguised as an accident? I grabbed my keys, the metal cool against my palm. I knew where I needed to go. Not back to the lab, not yet. I needed to revisit the scene, to see it through the killer's eyes, to find the flaw in their perfect performance. The drive across town was a blur of streetlights and a gnawing anxiety. I pulled up to the art dealer's upscale apartment building, the security guard barely glancing up as I flashed my old credentials. He recognized me, I could tell. The disgraced forensic scientist, back from the wilderness. I let myself in, the scent of expensive polish and stale air hitting me. The police had done their sweep, but they wouldn't have looked for what I was looking for, not with the same intensity, the same desperate hope. I moved through the silent apartment, my flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. I knelt by the spot where the canvas had fallen. I ran my gloved fingers over the polished wood floor, looking for anything out of place. A scuff mark, a stray fiber, a microscopic scratch. The killer had been meticulous, but no one was perfect. Then I saw it. It was barely visible, easily missed. I carefully retrieved it with tweezers, placing it in a sterile evidence bag. It was something else, something foreign. What if the killer wasn't just mimicking the old case? What if they were connected to it? What if the thread, the solvent, the discoloration, what if it all pointed back to a place, a person I dismissed long ago? I stood, the thread in my hand feeling like a live wire. The trap wasn't set yet. It was still being built, piece by agonizing piece. But now I had a new piece, and it was leading me not just to a killer, but to the very heart of my own undoing. The tension in the air was no longer just about catching a murderer. It was about confronting my past and praying it wouldn't consume me. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else. Something I'd spent years trying to forget. It clung to the stainless steel instruments, the cold slab, the very fibers of my worn jacket. My breath misted in the chill, each exhale a visible ghost in the stark illumination. This was where it all began, and now, it seemed, where it might all end. The deceased on the table was the latest piece in this horrifying tableau. The killer, whoever they were, was playing with me, using my own expertise as a weapon. They knew my history, knew the details of the original case, and they were taunting me with each new death. I leaned closer, my eyes scanning the body. The usual forensic markers were there, almost too perfectly presented. The precise angle of the wound, the subtle placement of a single, out-of-place object. It was a signature, a twisted artistic flourish. I'd seen it before, or rather, I'd identified it before. The original perpetrator had been clever, obscuring their tracks with a veneer of scientific understanding. But ultimately, they'd made a mistake. A tiny, almost imperceptible deviation from the pattern. This killer, though, they were tighter, cleaner. They anticipated my every move, it felt like. I'd followed the trail of breadcrumbs, each one leading me further into this labyrinth, and now here I was at the heart of it. The anonymous tip had led me here, to this sterile, silent chamber, promising answers. But the silence was deafening, and the only answer I felt was the tightening knot of dread in my gut. The single overhead light cast long, distorted shapes, making the familiar space feel alien and menacing. I could feel eyes on me, even though I was alone, or was I? "You shouldn't be here," a voice rasped, low and gravelly, slicing through the quiet. It came from the doorway, a figure silhouetted against the dim hallway light beyond. My heart gave a jolt, not of fear, but of recognition. The build, the posture, the deliberate stillness. I straightened slowly, my hands instinctively flexing, though I knew I was outmatched. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice steady, a practiced calm I didn't feel. The figure stepped forward into the pool of light. It was the investigator, the one I'd been working with, or rather, the one who had been pretending to work with me. His face was grim, etched with a weariness that went deeper than lack of sleep. But there was something else there, too. "I'm the one who's been cleaning up your messes, UserHH," he said, his voice devoid of any warmth. The one who's been making sure the evidence pointed where it needed to point. My mind reeled. Cleaning up messes, pointing evidence. It clicked, a sickening lurch in my stomach. He wasn't just an investigator. He was the architect of this entire charade. He was the one who had been feeding me information, guiding me, all while orchestrating these murders. It's the killer. You're the one, I breathed, the realization hitting me with the force of a physical blow. The meticulously staged scenes, the subtle misdirections, the intimate knowledge of forensic science. It all made a horrifying kind of sense. He'd used my own past, my own downfall, as a blueprint. He gave a slow, humorless smile. You're a fast learner, UserHH. Shame it took you this long. I thought you were supposed to be the brilliant one. He took another step, and now I could see the glint of something metallic in his hand. A scalpel, unnervingly familiar. Why? He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Because you were a loose end. Because you were getting too close. And because, UserHH, I wanted to see if I could do it better than you. He gestured to the body on the slab. More artful, more complete. My gaze flickered to the deceased, then back to him. The perfection I'd admired, the skill I'd grudgingly acknowledged, was a twisted reflection of my own lost brilliance. He hadn't just been killing people, he'd been proving a point, a twisted competition. You think you're better? I challenged, forcing strength into my tone. My mind raced, sifting through years of accumulated knowledge, searching for an edge. He knew forensics, yes, but did he understand the why, the human element? I am better, he stated, his eyes hard. I've learned from the best, and now you're going to be my final masterpiece. He advanced, the scalpel held steady. The tension in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was a palpable entity pressing down on me. My heart hammered, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs, but it wasn't just fear. It was a surge of adrenaline, a desperate need to survive, and a burning resolve to expose this monster. My knowledge, my very life's work, was my only weapon, and I wasn't going down without a fight. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was thick with the metallic tang of disinfectant and something else, something heavier. Grief, maybe, or the lingering scent of fear. I watched the forensic pathologist work, their movements precise, almost robotic. Every cut, every probe was a confirmation of what I already knew. The killer, the one who'd been taunting me, who'd mirrored my own meticulous methods with such chilling accuracy, was finally caught, or rather, apprehended. The chase had ended not with a bang, but with a whimper in a derelict warehouse, the perpetrator offering no resistance. My challenge, hurled into the stale air of the abandoned factory just hours ago, had hung there, unanswered. The killer, this phantom who'd stalked my life and my career, had simply stopped. No more elaborate crime scenes, no more coded messages left at the edge of the light. Just a silent surrender. I still didn't understand why they'd stopped, why they'd let themselves be found. Was it the confrontation? Had seeing me, the disgraced UserHH, finally broken their resolve? Or was it something else, a calculated move I hadn't yet deciphered? The pathologist held up a small, tarnished silver locket. It was identical to the one I'd found clutched in the hand of the first victim, the one that had started this whole nightmare. This was inside the abdominal cavity, the pathologist stated, their voice flat, devoid of emotion, sealed in a small, waterproof pouch. I leaned closer, my breath catching. This was the final piece, wasn't it? The connection that had eluded me, the one that proved this wasn't just a copycat, but the very same mind that had shattered my life years ago. I'd always suspected, of course. The precision, the signature elements, the sheer audacity. But this was undeniable. Anything else? I asked, my voice rough. I've been doing a lot of talking, a lot of challenging, and not enough listening. Now, in the quiet aftermath, I needed to absorb. The pathologist gestured to a small vial filled with a murky liquid. Traces of this were found under the fingernails. We're running it now, but it looks like some kind of specialized lubricant. Industrial grade. Lubricant. It clicked. Not just any lubricant. The kind used for high-precision machinery. The kind that would leave almost no trace, that would allow for incredibly delicate manipulation without damaging the evidence. It was the same type of lubricant I'd used in my lab years ago for those minuscule calibration tests. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the morgue's temperature. They'd said I'd tampered with evidence, that I'd fabricated results. The truth was, someone had framed me, planting subtle inconsistencies that only a mind as meticulous as mine could have created. And now, that same mind had resurfaced, not to destroy me, but to, what? Play a game. The pathologists continued their work, the rhythmic scrape of their instruments a counterpoint to my racing thoughts. They found nothing else of significance. The killer had been thorough, almost too thorough. It was as if they'd anticipated every move the authorities would make. I stood there for a long time, the sterile white room feeling like a cage. The killer was in custody. The case was closed, but the tension hadn't dissipated. It had merely shifted, morphing into a different kind of unease. I'd faced my tormentor, and they'd been caught. Yet I felt no triumph, only a profound sense of exhaustion and a lingering question. Was this truly the end? Or was it just another phase of the game, a carefully orchestrated pause before the final act? I looked at the locket again, now bagged and tagged. It was a symbol of the past, of the destruction it had wrought. But it was also a symbol of the present, of the truth I'd finally uncovered. The killer had used my own expertise against me, had twisted my methods into a weapon. And in doing so, they had forced me to confront not only them, but myself. As the pathologist finished their report, I turned and walked out of the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light. The city outside was still asleep, unaware of the drama that had unfolded within these sterile walls. I had won. The killer was apprehended. I had to believe this was over. I had to. The air in the county morgue autopsy suite at 2 a.m., single overhead light, was thick with the sterile tang of disinfectant and something else, something metallic and ancient. It clung to the back of my throat. My own breath felt too loud in the cavernous room, bouncing off the stainless steel tables and the cool, tiled walls. This place, even stripped bare and utilitarian, always felt like a tomb. Tonight, it felt like the very heart of one. The single overhead light cast a harsh, unforgiving glare, bleaching the color from everything. It highlighted the faint sheen on the autopsy table where the latest victim lay, covered by a sheet. But I wasn't looking at the sheet. I was looking at the small, almost imperceptible smear on the edge of the table, just below where the victim's arm would have been. It was barely visible, a faint iridescence under the focused beam of my penlight. Lubricant. It was the same type of lubricant I'd used in my lab years ago for those minuscule components in the microspectrometer, the one that had been the centerpiece of my downfall. My gut twisted. He knew about my work, about the specific tools I employed. He wasn't just mimicking my old cases, he was taunting me with the very techniques that had once defined me. A cold dread, familiar and unwelcome, began to snake its way up my spine. This wasn't just about catching a killer anymore. This was personal. This was an extension of the nightmare that had shattered my life. I knelt, my knees protesting against the hard linoleum. I brought my penlight closer, the beam dancing over the faint residue. My fingers itched to collect a sample, to run it through the portable analyzer I'd brought with me, but I held back. This was a trap, I knew it. Everything about this case had been a meticulously crafted lure. The detective stood by the door, his arms crossed, watching me with an unreadable expression. He'd been here for hours, a silent sentinel, trusting me to find what he couldn't. He'd seen the desperation in my eyes, the way I'd practically begged him to let me examine the scene myself, away from the prying eyes and hushed whispers of the department's current forensic team. They dismissed my theories, relegated me to the fringes, but he'd seen something in my conviction. I didn't look up. "It's him," I murmured, the words tasting like ash. "He's using the same lubricant I used, the stuff they said I used to tamper with evidence." I finally met his gaze, my own burning with a mixture of fury and despair. It wasn't tampering, it was calibration, precision. He's using it to make his moves so subtle, so perfect, that they're invisible to standard analysis. I gestured with my penlight towards the smear. This isn't just about replicating my old cases. It's about proving he can outdo me, that he understands my methods better than I did. A heavy silence descended again. The detective ran a hand over his stubbled chin. So, he's leaving I breadcrumbs, and then he wants to make me disappear just like he made the others. My own past flashed before my eyes, the accusations, the ruined reputation, the years spent in obscurity. This killer had weaponized my own brilliance against me. I stood, my legs stiff. The weight of the realization pressed down on me, heavier than the sterile air. He wasn't just a copycat. He was a student, a prodigy who had studied my every move, my every mistake. He had learned from my downfall. "What does he want, UserHH?" the detective asked, his tone urgent. "What's the end game?" I walked towards the large, stainless steel sink, the water pipes groaning as I turned on the tap. I ran cold water over my hands, scrubbing them with an almost violent intensity, as if I could wash away the contamination of this case, the ghost of my past. "He wants to prove he's superior," I responded, my voice clearer now, tinged with a new resolve. "He wants to dismantle everything I built. Then, he wants to show the world that he's the true master of precision, the one who can get away with anything." I looked at my reflection in the polished chrome of the faucet. Determination. "And he's been leaving clues, hasn't he?" I continued, thinking aloud. "Each victim, a specific technique. Each staged scene, a lesson. He's been teaching me, preparing me for the final act." The detective moved to stand beside me, his presence a solid anchor in the swirling uncertainty. "And what is the final act?" I dried my hands on a paper towel, the rough texture a welcome sensation. "He's been showing me his brilliance. Now he wants to eclipse it. He wants to show me how truly invisible he can be." I turned to face him, a plan forming, sharp and clear in my mind. He's been leaving me clues, but he's also been hiding in plain sight. Not here in this sterile tomb, somewhere unexpected. He wanted a grand finale, a final, undeniable demonstration of his superiority, and I knew now how to deliver it. "He's not just a killer, detective," I added, my voice steady. "He's an artist, and his masterpiece is about to be unveiled." I met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between us. The tension in the room hadn't dissipated, but it had shifted. The hunt was almost over, and for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face whatever came next.